What if I told you that we could figure out exactly what's inside a liquid just by measuring how well it carries a tiny electrical current? It kind of sounds like a magic trick, right? But it's actually a super powerful scientific technique called conductometry, and it lets us unlock all kinds of secrets hidden away in solutions. So, how does this actually work? Well, let's dive in and find out.
So here's what we've got on tap. We're going to start with the absolute basics, how electricity can even move through a liquid. Then we'll get into the rules that make it all happen. After that, we'll see the technique in action with something called a titration, learn how to read the results, and finally check out where this amazing science pops up in the real world. Okay, so first things first, we have to tackle the big question. How on earth can electricity travel through a liquid? The answer to this is really the key to everything else we're going to talk about.
Let's start with something you can probably relate to. How do we know if the water in a lake is actually clean? Or if the water coming out of our faucet is truly pure? I mean, you can't just look at it and tell, right? The secret is all about what's dissolved inside it, and that's where electricity comes into play.
Here's the secret. It is all about the ions. You know, pure distilled water is actually a terrible conductor of electricity. It barely lets any through. It's all the other stuff dissolved in the water, salts, minerals, that break apart into these little charged particles called ions. And those ions are what carry the electrical current. So the more ions you have floating around, the better that solution will conduct electricity. That's the whole game.
All right, so we know ions are the key players here, but to really get a handle on this, we need to dig into the rules of conductivity, the actual science behind that spark.
To really get this, we need to get two terms straight. The first one is resistance. That's how much something fights against electricity flowing through it. But what we're really interested in is its exact opposite, conductance. That's how easily electricity can flow. You can think of it like lanes on a highway. More lanes mean less resistance and higher conductance. We measure this in a unit called Siemens.
Now, obviously, we need a way to compare different liquids fairly, so scientists use a standardized measure called conductivity. Think of it as the specific, built-in conducting power of a substance, all measured inside a standard-sized box. This lets us compare apples to apples, or, salt water to tap water.
So what makes one liquid more conductive than another? Well, a few things are going on. The number of ions is the big one, for sure. More ions, more conductivity. But it also depends on how fast those ions can move around, how big they are, what kind of liquid they're in, and even the temperature. Hotter liquids usually conduct way better because all those ions are just zipping around with more energy.
So now that we've got the basic rules down, let's see how scientists actually put all this theory to work. We're going to take a look at a common lab technique called a titration. And this right here is the classic setup. You've got your sample in a beaker with a little conductivity probe dipped into it. Then from that long glass tube up top, called a burette, you slowly drip in another solution. All the while, the meter is tracking every little change in the conductivity. The process itself is pretty simple. You start with your sample, add the other solution, the titrant, drop by drop by drop, and you write down the conductance reading each and every time. Now, this is where the magic happens. You plot those readings on a graph, and you get this really distinct shape. And that exact point where the line suddenly changes direction, that's the endpoint. It tells you with amazing precision the exact moment the chemical reaction is finished. Let's look at a real example. Say we're adding a base to an acid. At the very beginning, the acid has tons of these super fast, highly mobile hydrogen ions, so the conductivity is really high. But as we add the base, those speedy little ions get turned into plain old water. They get replaced by slower moving ions from the base, and because of that, you see the conductivity take a sharp nosedive. And check this out. Right here, at the very bottom of that V shape, that point where the conductivity is at its absolute lowest, that's called the equivalence point. It's the exact moment when every last bit of the acid has been perfectly neutralized by the base. There's no guesswork at all. The graph tells you exactly when to stop. So what happens if we just keep on adding the base after we hit that point? Well, now there's no more acid left to react with, so we're just adding extra base into the mix. This introduces a whole flood of new, really conductive hydroxide ions. And since they have nothing to do, they just build up, and the conductivity starts shooting right back up again. That classic V shape is just one possibility. And what's so cool is that different types of reactions create totally different shapes on the graph. It's like every reaction tells its own little story, and we just have to learn how to read the curves.
Just look at the difference here. On the left, we've got that sharp V from a strong acid and a strong base. But look at the one on the right, where we use a weak base instead. See how after that endpoint, the line just goes kind of flat? So why does that happen? It's because the extra weak base we're adding doesn't really break up into ions very well, so it barely adds any conductivity. The shape of the graph is a dead giveaway for what kind of reaction is taking place. And the same exact pattern holds true if we start with a weak acid. If you add a strong base to it, you get a curve that rises pretty steeply after the endpoint. But if you use a weak base, yep, just like before, the line flattens out. Every single combination of acid and base strength creates its own unique graphical fingerprint. It's amazing. And this is where it gets really powerful. Check this out. We can even measure a mixture of a strong acid and a weak acid at the same time, in the same beaker. The graph actually shows us two separate breakpoints. The first one tells us when the strong acid is done, and the second one tells us when the weak acid is done. We can analyze a really complex mix with just one single, elegant experiment. So this is obviously a pretty amazing tool to have in a science lab. But where does it actually show up in our world? Let's take this out of the lab and into your life. Yeah, this is not just some abstract lab thing. It is used absolutely everywhere. Environmental scientists use it to check for pollution in our lakes and rivers. Marine biologists use it to measure how salty the ocean is. It's even used in the food and drug industries to make sure products are pure and safe, for everything from tracing microbes to detecting antibiotics.
So the bottom line is, this method is just incredibly useful. For one, you don't need any of those messy chemical color dyes. It works perfectly even if your sample is really cloudy or darkly colored, situations where your own eyes would totally fail you. And because you're getting the result from a graph, it's super accurate and works for all kinds of different reactions. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? By just translating a simple chemical reaction into a graph of electrical flow, we get this incredibly precise and powerful look into an invisible world. So the next time you look at a glass of water, or a lake, or even the ocean, just think, what else could we learn if we just listened in on the little electrical conversations happening inside?